Senator Fifield.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. Well, I can satisfy the Manager of Government Business. He is correct. We will be opposing this motion, and we will be opposing it for the same reason that we opposed the other motions to vary hours, the same reason that we opposed the motion for an extra week of Senate sitting, the same reason that we opposed the motion giving effect to the sham committee that Senators Cormann and Senators Birmingham were forced to participate in but did a magnificent job. It is for the same reason that we will be opposing this motion, and that is to support any of those motions on the variation of hours, an extra week of the Senate or the sham committee or this motion. To support any of those motions would be to be complicit in the Australian Labor Party's breach of faith with the Australian people. That is what the government has asked us to do time and again, is to be complicit, to help them facilitate the breaking of a solemn election commitment. And we go back to the last election, as we have to each and every time that we debate procedural motions in this chamber in relation to the carbon tax. We have to go back to the last election, where the Prime Minister put her hand on her heart. She made that solemn declaration to the Australian people that there will be no carbon tax under a government I lead. We have to come back to that each and every time, because it's as a result of the repudiation of that solemn election commitment that we find ourselves in this chamber today debating this particular motion. Now, it wasn't just any old commitment that the Prime Minister gave, Mr Deputy President. It was a solemn commitment. It was a commitment without qualification. Often, when a political leader makes a commitment, they will bracket it with qualifications, depending on particular circumstances, depending on an election result, depending on the state of the budget at the time that they gain office. But there were no such qualifications in the case of the Prime Minister's carbon tax commitment. And so we cannot allow the government to seek to have this chamber be complicit in facilitating the breach of an election commitment. Mr Deputy President, I've got to say, one of the most bizarre things I have seen and heard since I have been in this place was the words from Mr Graham Perrott from the other place yesterday, where he said, I can't possibly countenance a change of Prime Minister. I can't possibly countenance that, because that would be a breach of faith with my constituents. Because I broke faith with them once before, because I backed Kevin Rudd. Kevin Rudd was our leader. They voted for me firstly thinking Kevin Rudd would be Prime Minister, but then I breached faith with them by being part of the Australian Labor Party, which changed the leader that the people had elected. So I can't breach faith with the public again, and that's why, even though Prime Minister Gillard is the worst thing for the Australian Labor Party and the Australian public don't want her, I have to stand by her, because that would be a breach of faith. Now, I mean, that's pretty tortured logic, you must admit, Mr Deputy President, but talk about swallowing the camel and straining at the gnat, to quote the Bible, Mr Deputy President. Hello? What is the greatest breach of commitment which we have seen in recent Australian political history? It is that of the Prime Minister that there will be no carbon tax under a government I lead. Yet Mr Perrott thinks, oh, that's okay, that doesn't matter. I mean, you know, that's just a minor policy issue. That's just a minor policy issue to him. No, the great matter which is before the Australian public at the moment is, oh, I can't breach faith with my electorate because they thought Julia Gillard was going to become the Prime Minister. Well, I've got to explain to Mr Perrott, and probably members of the Australian Labor Party more generally, how our system of government works. You see, individuals in electorates, they don't vote for party leaders. They vote for the candidate in their local seat. That's what they do. What the role of the party leader is to articulate the party platform. The role of the leader is to articulate the party policy. And that is what Ms Gillard did. She did her job, and she articulated the party policy, which was there will be no carbon tax. So I think Mr Perrott really does need to understand how our system works, and that it is in fact his leader who has breached faith with the Australian public. So anyway, I hope those opposite Mr Perrott find that explanation helpful, because I think they certainly need it. I do agree with the Manager of Government Business that this is historic legislation. He stated that, and he's right. This is historic legislation because we have not seen legislation that will have such a detrimental effect on the Australian economy being introduced by an Australian government. Now, the government readily concedes that this legislation will increase the cost of living. They readily concede that. They readily concede that electricity prices will go up by at least 10%. They readily concede that businesses will take a hit. We might disagree with them about the magnitude of that hit, but even the government concede that this will make life harder for businesses, that business input costs will go up. Even this government concedes that over the next several decades that there will be the equivalent of $1 trillion hit on the Australian economy, roughly equivalent to 1 year's economic output for Australia. Now, governments are meant to be in the business of making life easier for business. Governments are meant to be in the business of improving the standard of living and the quality of life of Australians. So this is indeed historic legislation where a government is consciously and deliberately seeking to harm business, seeking to harm households, seeking to damage the Australian economy. So Minister Ludwig for once nailed it. This is historic legislation. But where I do differ with him is he said that we shouldn't be having this procedural debate because this issue is well settled, because the need for a carbon tax is well settled. And he said that we've been having this debate for 20 years, and I've heard Mr Albanese say that there have been 38 parliamentary inquiries into the carbon tax legislation. Wrong. Wrong. Completely wrong. A carbon tax as a concrete proposition before the Australian people has only been there for a matter of months, because there wasn't even a carbon tax as a concrete proposition before the Australian people at the last election. That's the whole point. The Prime Minister fibbed. There was no concrete proposition for a carbon tax before the Australian people at the last election. It was specifically ruled out to the contrary. So this absolute rubbish that we hear time and again from Mr Albanese, that we hear time and again from Minister Ludwig, that this issue is well settled, that we've had 38 parliamentary inquiries into a carbon tax, that a carbon tax is something which has really been debated for 20 years. What rubbish! What absolute rot! And that is their defence for where we are today, for the fact that they are seeking to rush into this place legislation that seeks to breach a solemn election commitment. Mr Deputy President, this government just don't get it. They are determined to force onto the Australian people something which the Australian people don't want. The Australian people have made it clear in the ballot box, because all bar one or perhaps two members of the House of Representatives were elected on a platform of there not being a carbon tax. So the Australian people have made it clear at the ballot box at the last election they do not want a carbon tax. The Australian people have made it clear in just about every opinion poll. Now, we shouldn't slavishly follow the polls. We shouldn't be led by the polls. We're political leaders. It's our job to articulate a case and to prosecute it with the Australian public, regardless of whether it enjoys majority support or not. But it's a very arrogant government that does not take heed, at least of the pattern, at least of the trend, in every single opinion poll in relation to the carbon tax. That is the height of arrogance by any government. Now, Mr Deputy President, we recognise that the government, having broken their solemn commitment to the Australian public, have succeeded today in the House of Representatives, only a matter of minutes ago, in getting the carbon tax legislation through the Parliament, through the House of Representatives, I should say. Mr Deputy President, this is indeed a dark day for Australia. This is indeed a very dark day for Australia, when a government which was formed on the back of a lie has completed its first challenge to get this legislation through the House of Representatives. They're halfway there. They're halfway through the process of breaching their election commitment. So this is a very dark day. No doubt Labor members over in the other place will be celebrating today. They'll be cheering. They'll probably be walking out doing doorstops, saying what a terrific day this is for the environment, what a terrific day this is for the Australian economy. But we know from the great work done by Senator Cormann on his Senate Select Committee, the Senate Select Committee on the Scrutiny of New Taxes, that this will be a tax which will be for economic pain but no environmental gain. So sadly, that legislation has passed through the House of Representatives, and I guess there's one upside of that, and that is the names of each and every member who voted for that legislation, the names of each and every member who broke their solemn commitment to the Australian public will be recorded for the voters to look at the next election. But even though that legislation has passed through that place, Mr Deputy President, we still have a job to do in this chamber. And Minister Ludwig says, "Oh, what's the point of a debate? What's the point of discussing the legislation in this place? You on the other side have already decided what you're going to do." Well, yeah, that's right. We have. We have already decided what we're going to do, that we are going to oppose this legislation. But this chamber, even where the conclusion may be foregone, even where it may be a foregone conclusion, this chamber still has a job to do, to apply scrutiny, to air issues and to put the focus on government hypocrisy. That is part of the role of this chamber, is to hold the government of the day to account. So where a government has breached a commitment, that we should take the time, we should take the appropriate time to put a focus on that, to highlight it and to ask again and again why the government felt the need to breach their election commitment. So we make no apology for that. We have a job to do institutionally in the Westminster system as an opposition to hold the government to account, and we are doing that. We make no apology for that. But more broadly, this chamber also has a role to provide scrutiny. This chamber also has a role as a House of Review, regardless of the partisan positions on a particular issue. This chamber has a role, and we're determined to do that, even if those on the other side of the chamber aren't. And we know those on the other side of the chamber aren't committed to even a modicum of scrutiny in this place because of the way that they treated the committee process, the committee inquiry process in relation to the clean energy package. It is usual in this place, where we have significant legislation, for that legislation to be considered by the committees of the Senate. That's why they're there, that's why they're established. And historically, this chamber hasn't taken much notice, quite rightly, of what they do in the other place. If they want to have their own committee inquiries, terrific. If there are joint committee inquiries, great. But that does not dictate or determine what the committees of this Senate do. And so it was extremely disappointing when this chamber declined, or in fact voted against, the proposal of senators on this side that we refer the carbon tax package legislation to each of the Senate committees to inquire into those areas for which they have jurisdiction. That is pretty much what happened when the goods and services tax was being looked at, when the new tax system legislation was introduced, that there were numerous Senate committees which met simultaneously looking at different aspects of the goods and services tax legislation. Now, that legislation was not nearly as far-reaching as the carbon tax package. So if it was good enough for the new tax system legislation, if it was good enough for the GST legislation to go through that exhaustive inquiry process over a period of some 5 months, then how much more so is it appropriate and necessary that the committees of the Senate examine that legislation, that carbon tax legislation in this place? Instead, we had what I referred to as the sham committee, the committee which was racked and stacked, which was racked, had those carbon tax bills, 19 of them, racked up to go into the one committee. It was stacked in terms of its membership. The conclusion was foregone. It was a foregone conclusion. And the committee met, Senator Cormann, I think, for, what was it, 2 weeks? 1 week. 1 week. Sorry, I was being too generous. 1 week. 1 week of inquiry by one committee on a package of 19 bills which will have the most far-reaching effects on the Australian economy. 1 week. 1 week, Mr Deputy President. I can see your incredulity there, but it is true. Mr Deputy President, those opposite have proposed, and we will now have an extra sitting week in the Senate to scrutinise this legislation. And that's meant to demonstrate how committed they are to scrutiny. But it's a pretty weird approach where you say, we're going to give you an extra week, but we're going to guillotine debate. How does that work? You know, give with one hand, take with the other. Well, we're against that extra week because, again, we would be complicit in the facilitation of the breach of an election commitment. And 1 week isn't enough anyway. This legislation should be looked at for a minimum of about 4 or 5 months. That's what should happen if we're to perform our duty as legislators, something which those opposite don't have the slightest interest in. But we all know what should actually happen, Mr Deputy President, and that is those opposite should withdraw this motion. They should withdraw the subsequent motion in relation to exempting these bills from the cut-off, and they should in fact discharge this legislation from the parliament. They should then have the Prime Minister go to Yarralumla. In fact, that might actually suit her at the moment. She might avoid something which may or may not take place in a few weeks. But she should go to Yarralumla and she should say to the Governor-General, look, I've actually made a bit of a blunder. I told a fib to the Australian people. They're actually not very happy about it. It would be unconscionable for me to continue to pursue this legislation through the Australian Parliament. Therefore, Governor-General, I'm asking you for an election because I think the Australian people deserve to have their say on the carbon tax, and I think the current situation where the government is completely incapable of governing, not through any fault, I might say, of the opposition. I mean, you know, if anything, we're probably a little too cooperative at times, Mr Deputy President, for our own good. So no fault of the opposition, and I hear Senator McDonald, for whose benefit that remark was made. Mr Deputy President, she should say to the Governor-General, we can't do anything properly. We are incompetent. We are a hopeless government. It doesn't matter if it's pink bats, school halls, green loan scheme, cash for clunkers, border protection, or for that matter, breaching fundamental election commitments like not introducing a carbon tax. She should say, Governor-General, for all these reasons, please grant me an election. That actually is the procedural matter which should be attended to today. It shouldn't be the motion which is before us, which is seeking the indulgence of the chamber, seeking the connivance of the opposition to facilitate the breach of promise to the Australian people. Mr Deputy President, it's not an indulgence we will grant the government. It is not a connivance which we will take part in. This is a very sad day. This is a very dark day for the Australian people. The legislation having passed the House of Representatives. But we, on this side, despite the fact the matter has been lost in the other place, we on this side will continue to fight this legislation. We will continue to fight every motion and procedure which seeks to facilitate it. And, Mr Deputy President, it is not too late. It is not too late for those opposite to say, I think, what's really in their hearts and to act on it, and that is that they've breached faith with the Australian people. They shouldn't proceed. They should go to their leader and say, we need to abandon this. Not only is it electoral suicide for us, but it is morally wrong. to continue down this path of breaching faith with the Australian public. That's what they should do. If the Australian Labor Party wants to regain some decency of the Labor Party of old, then that's what they should do. Mr Deputy President, we will be opposing this motion.